everyone, and welcome to the March 14th meeting of the Transportation and Planning Committee. I am Julie Eisel, chair of the committee, and we have with us I'll let everybody introduce themselves this morning, including staff, and then we'll jump into our agenda. So let's go ahead and start with the individuals in the room.
Braxton Winston at large, committee member.
Liz Babson, Charlotte Department of Transportation.
Yolanda Jones, planning staff.
Ed McKinney, Charlotte Department of Transportation.
Jason Lawrence, Charlotte Area Transit System.
Lynn Alexander, Charlotte Department of Transportation.
Kathy Cornett, planning staff.
Alicia Osborne, planning staff.
Allison Craig, interim planning director.
Larkin Eggleston, committee vice chair.
Anyone else online?
Victoria Watlinson, District 3.
Ed Driggs, District 7.
How about any staff? Any additional staff members?
Donata Jackson, Office of Constituent Services.
Thanks. Dave Fenton, Planning.
This is Matt Prosser with Economic and Planning Systems.
And David Green with Perkins and Will.
Okay, is that everybody? Okay, let me get back to my screen. I apologize. Mr. Eggleston and I are in Washington, D.C. for the National League of Cities. So we are doing this remotely. And let me just get back to my agenda. This morning, we've got 3 items to update you all on, kind of a continuation of last month's meeting. The first item is going to be the Strategic Mobility Plan Policy Review, and that's going to be presented by Ed McKinney. And so I will go ahead and let Ed jump right into that.
Great, thank you. Thanks again for the time this morning. Again, I'm Ed McKinney with the Charlotte Department of Transportation. And what we want to do this morning is just give you a brief update on the work we've been doing, a little reminder of some of the discussions we had last month, and then give you a preview of where we're heading for some of our next conversations with the committee coming up in the next couple of months, particularly around something we want to talk with you today about, this notion of how we're going to structure the strategic mobility plan around priority investment. And so really wanted to kind of tee up that discussion and talk with you about next steps with the committee. If you go to the next slide. So you've seen this diagram before. I wanted to just use this as a reminder and sort of frame it in slightly different ways. As we've talked about before, the comprehensive plan has been that vision for our growth. The strategic mobility plan has been a part of a suite of things, including the policy map and the unified development ordinance are, again, a suite of things that are really being designed to implement the vision of the comprehensive plan. As we've talked about the strategic mobility plan, we've organized it sort of in 2 buckets. The streets manual, which was those components we've been talking about with you around the streets map. We've talked in some detail around the comprehensive transportation review. Those 2 things, and what I've shown on this diagram is the notion that those 2 things have been really focused around how we shape private investment in mobility. And again, I'll briefly remind you and talk a little bit about what we shared with you last month about how those 2 things in particular relate to private development. What we haven't yet talked with you about is that other half, what we would call our mobility policy, and more specifically, a term we're defining around our priority investment strategy. And the way I would describe that again is, on that half, is how do we begin to take our policies and shape it into our public investment in mobility. And the goal here really is ensuring that our strategic mobility plan is building from the comprehensive plan, refining our mobility policies to ensure that the priorities and the investments that we make from a mobility standpoint are fully in line with the vision we have for growth around both the comprehensive plan, the policy map, and ultimately the unified development ordinance. So if you go to the next slide, just as a reminder, we talked about this last month, but I wanted to just put it back up here and again in a slightly different sort of context and say if all of this was around how we shape private investment in mobility, and again, I use this example This is a snapshot of the corridor, South Boulevard. If you go to the next slide, we talked about the layering of all of the things that are going on right now, the place type and the policy map, the Unified Development Ordinance, and then this component of our strategic mobility plan called the streets map. And so as a reminder, we said if you're, in this case, you're on South Boulevard, you're in a place adjacent to transit, you're from a policy map standpoint, a regional activity center, we have a Unified Development Ordinance district that is designed to be that tool that guides the private development of that kind of place, in this case, a transit urban center zoning district. And then as we've talked about from a mobility policy standpoint, we have defined what we believe the vision and the future of that corridor from a mobility infrastructure. And so the streets map helps to define the travel lane configuration, the kind of facility we would have for bike and mobility, and ultimately the dimensions and the shaping of our public realm of the sidewalk and planning strip. So again, the point here is to mention and remind you that we're working, the strategic mobility plan is part of a suite of tools we're using to guide how we sort of design and shape growth from a private development standpoint. Now, again, I want to quickly just introduce the other half of this. If you go to the next slide, I'll go back to this diagram. I want to now talk about this other half of our strategy around mobility, and it's really this notion of a priority investment strategy. If you go to the next slide, and why Jason Lawrence is sitting here next to me is it's what we wanted to make sure as we describe the importance of really a holistic vision for how we build a connected network. And it's really beyond just how we deal with our road infrastructure. It's a fundamental part of that is transit. And I wanted Jason here, who's Director of Planning for CATS, to be sitting here hand in hand talking about what that vision looks like and how we begin to connect all of those components together in a more holistic way.
Thank you, Ed. And you see on the graphic here, I mean, throughout any given day, you see this with each of your own trips as you go throughout your business. You're either walking, you're on a bike, scooter, first, last mile, Uber, Lyft, transit, and your own vehicle, private vehicle, traveling throughout the network. And when it comes to transit, the quality of that transit service is the network that it connects to, that it's a part of, and the land uses that are connected to it. And so as you see the priority, frequency network that could occur with the transit line going through that, the success of that is by and large of the quality of the connections that are to it, through park and ride connections, through a connected road network, bikes and trails and greenways networks that are connected to mobility hubs along that line, but also making sure that our transit system is future ready with mobility hubs that can enable those first and last mile connections through ride sharing services or CAT's own future on-demand services that we'll be talking about later in our bus priority discussions and to this committee.
So next slide, what does that mean? And so what I want to kind of drill that down into kind of what that, how that vision begins to be shaped in our strategic mobility plan, and what we would describe that is to start getting focused. Now, if our vision is to build that connected network that Jason just described, then what we're doing in our strategic mobility plan is starting to focus more specifically around what I would call the priority investment strategy around some of the key modes. And so transit is a big part of that, but again, as you see from this, the mobility plan will get more focused and specific around what our bike priority network should look like. What's the next set of priorities? How are we building that connected network? What would be the next set of projects that would help us build the vision that's defined in the comprehensive plan? Same thing from a walk and pedestrian safety standpoint. And again, much of this is building upon the policies and plans that we already have in place. Council spent a lot of time last week at your budget workshop talking about the investment that we've been making in our sidewalk and pedestrian safety programs and the investment that we've made historically. And again, our notion is to continue that policy, shape it within the context of this broader network and these broader goals we have from the comprehensive plan, but build upon the great work that we've been doing. Similarly, on the roadway side, and again, we've introduced this a little bit last week, the notion of really focusing now on some key mobility improvement corridors and looking at a whole holistic set of improvements that aren't just about one specific project or one specific intersection. How are we looking at our roadway corridors more holistically from a capacity and vehicular movement standpoint? And then lastly, I'll throw it back to Jason to talk about how we then make sure that the investment that CATS is doing in transit, both from a bus and rail transit standpoint, fit into that holistic picture.
Exactly. So what we'll be coming to over the next couple of months, presenting to you, is our Envision My Ride Bus Priority Corridor network that's not only just focusing on high-frequency corridors, but also a bus priority network that will line up with the strategic mobility plan, but it won't stop there. I think there's a greater focus on the bus stop and the connections that they can make, and a newer topic that we're talking more and more about called mobility hubs that will really help us with that first last mile connections.
As you can see from what Jason's talking about, so much of that kind of investment is really integral to how we manage our right-of-ways and our roads. So it's really important, and this is why for this discussion, we want to make sure it's clear that the relationship between what CATS is doing and what CDOT is doing and how we're trying to build that connected network are completely woven together because they're just so interrelated. That investment and that infrastructure are really one and the same. And what we're trying to do is make sure we're building a city and a set of places that provide that balanced set of mobility options holistically. So last slide, just kind of a preview of where we're going. I wanted to just, today was really just to kind of tee up the discussion and the kind of notion around this kind of priority investment strategy. As you can imagine, there's lots more details that we will want to be coming back to you in each of those buckets. So we wanted to really tee that discussion up, but we'll be back with you again back in later in April and May. We will, as I mentioned before, we will have a draft release of the plan out in April, and ultimately the goal is to have this back in front of council in June for consideration and adoption. So with that, that's just a really brief overview that we wanted to cover today, and we'll be glad to open up for any other questions.
Thank you. Thanks, Ed. I don't see any council members with hands up, committee or attendees.
Mayor Pro Tem,
Braxton, go ahead.
I just got a comment. Thank you for the explanation, the differentiation between private investment and public investment. I think that's an important point, and important for us in council to understand how, where we're dealing with each part. I'll say in dealing with public investment, I'll just make a comment. In dealing with public investment in our growth strategies, I believe the city council is going to have to balance priorities. I think the biggest push and pull is going to be the perceived dichotomies between economic growth and safety, but particularly bike and pedestrian safety. Well, I believe this council member believes that's a false dichotomy, but obviously I think it will come up. I would like to see mobility policy priorities and investments focus on slowing down vehicular traffic in neighborhoods and focus on maintaining certainty in transit times along commuter and commercial corridors. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Winston. Mr. Driggs?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just wondered, are the transportation and transit provisions that you're talking about, Ed, integrated into the UDO? Or is this kind of a separate overlay that people who are developing petitions need to consider? Do we have a seamless process here for taking on board these requirements and what's in the UDO?
Yeah, this is a great question, and my answer to that would be a little bit of both. I mean, we talked a little bit about that using the streets map as an example, where we have a vision for a street like in the example I've used as South Boulevard, and as you can see, both the UDO and our streets map requirements set some expectations about as development incrementally occurs. We want it to set here. We want to make sure that they're providing for the right space we need for sidewalk and bike facilities and road facilities. But we do that, as you know, we've talked about before, that's an incremental thing that happens with what is we believe to be a reasonable expectation of development, as it develops. But, as JL painted that broader picture, we know that really this is a system. We can't only develop that system incrementally. We have to decide and prioritize strategic citywide public investment. So that's a long answer to say there are provisions in the UDO that says, yes, we expect you to provide some of this mobility infrastructure site by site based on the scale of what you're developing. But at the same time, the point of this strategic mobility plan is to make sure that then we also are seeing the bigger picture, prioritizing where those strategic connected network and system needs to be, and then putting the public investment holistically in those corridors and those places to make it work. So, there might be corridors, for example, where we want to, with CATS, encourage and build, bus priority investment and getting to certainty about transit. That does mean that as development occurs on that corridor, we're going to have some expectations for them. But then, yes, for sure, we're going to have to, with CATS, invest in the operations, invest in the infrastructure, and invest in, in some cases it might be signal priority on a corridor. There's a whole sort of suite of holistic things we would need to do from a public
So Ed,
but also on the private side.
Ed, the simple question though is I'm just concerned about user friendliness here. Our goal with the UDO was to take a whole bunch of patchwork of different policies and integrate and streamline them. So I just want to make sure that we have clarity and simplicity when it comes to what is required of people who want to develop. So I'll just make that point. You don't need to respond any further, but I don't want people to have to look in 5 different places to find out, or 2 or 3 different places to find out what is required. And my other point would just be briefly to what you just said. I have in budget argued that we need to have CIP capacity because there is a public part to all of this, and it's inevitable. And I don't know if we're sufficiently prepared for that. I'll just offer that comment. Thanks, Ed.
Last thing I'll say, the UDO does put it all in one place. So I'm looking towards Allison, but I don't want there to be any debate. The expectations we have on the private side are in one place. They're in the Unified Development Ordinance, and we're doing lots of work to test those. But there's no debate. It's in one place.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
Thank you, Ed. With that, we'll go ahead and move on to the policy map update. And for that, we've got Alicia Osborne, Kathy Cornett, Matt Proser, and Jay Rankins that's going to give us that update. So go ahead, Alicia.
Was about the 2040 policy map. Last week, we gave a pretty detailed presentation about how the policy map will be amended, but today we wanted to just spend a little bit of time talking about, just kind of walk down memory lane, if you will, just to talk about the process, our engagement today. Next slide, please. Our engagement today, what we've heard along the way, to make sure that you all know that we have really been listening and working with the community to respond to their comments, and to also to help them just understand how all this works. It's pretty complex if you're not in it every day, but the way we've been communicating with internally with our team as well as with the community is just making it really understandable around how it all links to the comp plan, then the policy map, and how it all relates to the UDO and what it means for them when development happens. And then we'll talk a little bit about the recommended changes. We have some highlights. We won't put all the changes in this particular presentation, but they are provided in your briefing book, and I'll talk about where else you can find those. And then what's next for community planning, we talked about that. And then the schedule and our path forward. Next slide, please. So here's our schedule. We have not stopped. As you can see, we started developing and testing place types really back in 2015, to be honest, but really started rebooting that process back in February, long before the comp plan was adopted, or even if we knew it was going to be adopted. We still were working on this because we know that the community really wants, to Mr. Driggs's point, a one-stop shop for what's the vision and the tools for developing or responding to that vision for their community. So we started testing place types back in February, wrapped that up in July, and kicked off the policy map process with engagement, sending out a survey, and I'll tell you about the numbers for that, and then producing 3 iterations of the map. And each time you'll see how the comments were reduced in each phase. And that simply means that people were listening, we were listening, and that we were able to make some adjustments along the way. And now we're looking at possibly adoption at the end of this month. Next slide, please. So here's phase 1. I mentioned the survey, and I wanted to just pause for a minute on that. We sent a postcard to every resident in Charlotte, introducing the project, telling them how to get engaged, and sending a link to a survey to get their feedback on what types of places do they want to see in their particular neighborhood where they live, work, and play, and what else should complement those place types. So it was really about desirability of place types, adjacencies. What do you think should complement where you live? What do you think should complement where you work? If you work in Uptown, what else do you need in close proximity to that? So people could really be introduced to the tool as well as understand how these place types work together to create complete neighborhoods. Next slide. So phase 2, we released the map, and that was the first time that people saw place types on the map and looking at the future of what the community could look like based on the goals within the comp plan. And received 960 comments. That was on the online application, through emails, through conversations, one-on-one conversations that we had. We wanted to make sure that we were listening and put all the information out on the website if you were, because this is a map, so a lot of the comments were spatial. So we wanted to make sure if people told us something in person, we would provide that comment on the map so that there'd be a one-stop shop and a repository of all the comments throughout the entire process. And so moving forward, we kind of categorized our comments into 2 big buckets. Technical revisions, those were data corrections, some things that we needed to tweak with the methodology because it is a citywide map. And then there were community-driven revisions, things that we needed to hear from the community because they live in these places and work and play in these places, what is actually on the ground. So it was a good partnership with us, internal staff, and the community in making those revisions moving forward. Next slide. So here's some of the technical revisions during phase 2 engagement. Lots of words, but in summary, we had to make sure that there was improve the accuracy between taking our existing land uses, translating them to 10 place types. There were over, I asked Kathy this morning, I know there are over 50 land use classifications that we had to cross over to the place types, translate to the place types, as well as zoning districts. What you see in the ordinance today is pretty much what we were working with. So there's older districts and some districts that are more familiar now, but we had to really take a look at how do those translate to our existing toolbox and make sure we were accurate as we could be with those as well. Also looked at, we had heard some comments around utilities being identified as M&L, like a cell phone tower or a utility tower, making sure that those were absorbed within the surrounding place types so it didn't appear to have an industrial use within the neighborhood. And so that really speaks to the environmental justice metric within the equitable growth framework, where our residents have told us, let's be mindful of how we place future manufacturing logistics sites in our neighborhoods. And then the other large technical revision is making sure that we accurately categorize our parks. In the past, we have only identified greenways and larger parks, but we wanted to make sure that our neighborhood parks were absorbed within our neighborhoods to really speak to that goal around complete neighborhoods, that there are other smaller uses that can be in our neighborhoods, and also making sure that we were accurate in identifying our community and regional parks. Next slide. Some of the community-driven revisions, lots of words again on this slide, but 3 highlights are really taking and working with our historic district program manager to make sure that we were looking at how historic districts interact with place type designations and the other recommendations near our neighborhoods and historic districts. Also wanted to make sure that we, the other revisions are around looking at the commercial areas and how might they transition to more neighborhood center, being more forward thinking and not just acknowledging what's there today, but how might they transition to a neighborhood center in the future. Also looking at providing more neighborhood 2 or more medium to higher density residential closer to transit station areas. So not necessarily just community activity center where you're find your traditional transit-oriented development, but leading up to those corridors, how might we be intentional about providing more higher density residential in those locations? So we made some adjustments to respond to that need as well. Next slide. So here's phase 3 engagement. Again, notice the transition and the numbers, they get a little bit less. So we were really responsive and tweaking the map as we go. 688 comments received in this phase. A lot of the comments were started to be more parcel specific, where individuals were looking at their parcel outside of the context of the block or what's surrounding them. And so we do know that we've talked about how planning continues and that those types of conversations where we're looking at parcel-specific issues and how they impact the broader areas around them will be happening during our community area planning process. So a lot of those comments were not incorporated into this map, understanding that we will take a closer look at those during our community area planning process. Next slide. So here are just a summary of some of the outstanding comments, and we've categorized them. So the place type palette comments are around were conversations that we had with participants or residents that said this use isn't allowed in N1 or in the community activity center. So it was just around having that conversation about here's what the place type actually allows. And so as you can see, a lot of those comments were around that particular discussion. Again, I mentioned parcel specific conversations around here's my property, I want it to be designated as a community activity center. It's like, well, that's not how it works, but we'll look at that closely during the community area planning process. And then some recommendations or comments were just in conflict with our goals with the comprehensive plan. I think people just having that conversation and understanding now we have an adopted policy document that guides our growth. How we make decisions will be based on that foundation. And then there were some comments related to traffic-related issues as well as UDO-related issues. And I want to mention our UDO-related comments. We made sure that our partners in the department leading and working on the UDO team have those comments and that we're having a discussion around what those issues are and how might they be addressed through both processes. So what comes to this process and vice versa with the UDO, we're sharing and talking to each other about solutions and what makes sense to respond to within this version of the policy map and the UDO and how it might be addressed in a future initiative. So we are discussing and having ongoing conversations about that. Next slide. So the final recommended draft was released in mid-February, and again, I wanted to call attention to the number and how it continues to reduce in terms of comments received. And that's not to say that people aren't having dialogue, they just have less things that they're questioning at this point in the process, and understand that what can be addressed with the map and what might be addressed with a future planning initiative. Next slide, please. There's that delay. There we go. And so some of the outstanding comments, we really, and a part of the methodology was around preserving our neighborhoods. And a lot of some of our comments were inconsistent with that. I mentioned before that some people wanted very parcel-specific designations to things that weren't consistent with the comp plan goals. We heard some comments around our campus designation. That's a new consolidation of how we think about large institutional uses as well as office parks, and how they can evolve to be more of mixed-use centers or site-serving, introduce site-serving retail and other mixed uses for those particular uses. So that's the campus designation. So we're working with our UDO team to make sure that that translation between the place types and the development regulations are matching up. We also have some conversations with people who wanted a request for a change that didn't align with the existing entitlements on the site. One of the key things that we wanted to make sure with this policy map is that we did not take away existing entitlements for our parcels or properties within the policy map. And also, there were some comments around, again, the policy, the place type palette. What can be incorporated or what was not already accommodated within the policy map. So we're continuing to have those discussions. Next slide. So here's the community engagement totals in summary. Our numbers for each phase, what we've done, and how we progress in being responsive and making sure that people understand that planning continues in the process. Next slide. Next slide, please. So here's just a snapshot of some of the recommended revisions. There are 88 different sites on the current final map that we are recommending that we make some revisions to. Those corrections will be available in your briefing book, as well as they're on the online application, the map application, and as well as a log on the public comments. So all of this information is available on our website and to the public, so they can see exactly and know what parcels we're recommending for a policy map change at this phase of the process. Again, our comment period doesn't close, so there might be more adjustments, but here's where we are today and where you can find those specific sites recommended for a mapping change. Next slide. Again, those there are two categories that we're recommending. So again, I mentioned the entitlements. Wanted to make sure that the existing entitlements align with the future recommended place type. And then making sure that recent rezonings are reflected on the map as well. And then the others are looking at thresholds and locational criteria, meaning at what point does an N1 go to an N2, and looking at the location in which those changes are occurring and making sure that the map reflects them accurately. Next slide. So this is the summary of the percentage of place types with each iteration of the map. So this is a popular slide. So the top bar is our adopted future land use map, and some might remember it being called a status quo map. And it shows the percentage of our neighborhoods. Again, a large part of our city is neighborhoods. And then the other parts of the pie are around non-residential uses like manufacturing, logistics, our regional activity centers and parks. So what you will see within each iteration of the map, there's some slight changes between the neighborhoods designations between N1 and N2, trying to strike that balance with how do we provide additional growth for households in the appropriate location, preserve our existing neighborhoods, and then also provide locations for job growth and parks and open space. So you'll see how parks and the designation for that place type has grown with the first, second, and the final recommended map as opposed to our current policy. And that's our effort to recognize our regional community parks, our trails and greenways as well. So that's that increase in that designation. You'll also see the other non-residential uses like M&L and our community activity centers where we are proposing jobs. In the M&L designation, the purple, the dark purple and the light purple is the innovation mixed use. That's where our jobs are primarily envisioned to grow. And you'll see that preservation of that. But what's different is in the place type growing in the future is how those jobs occur in adjacency, those uses occur in adjacency to our neighborhoods as well. Also, you will see a slight increase in our campus designation between the second, the second and the final draft of the map. And that's to reflect where our institutional and office park settings are envisioned to evolve over time. But take a look at the dark blue, and that's where our community activity centers are. That's where a lot of our mixed uses are occurring, where our transit station areas, and where the higher density residential is also intended to go. So you may not see a big increase in neighborhood 1 and neighborhood 2, but a lot of our community activity centers include the opportunity for additional household residential growth as well. Next slide. So what's next for community area planning? These series of slides, next slide please, are just a recap of what we shared last Monday. I know we've received a couple of emails from people asking for this presentation, so we'll run through these pretty quickly, and they're available on our website as well. So what happens after the map's adopted? The effective date is envisioned to be July 1. This map will retire existing current land use tool, which is the tool that council uses today to make land use and capital investment decisions. But we will also monitor and track the process and the process of the map and the comprehensive plan, making sure that our community as well as our staff and council and our elected officials know where we are with making decisions against this map. So if there's inconsistencies, we'll have a report that we produce just to make sure that we understand the trends in our decision making and how, if there needs to be adjustments to the map in another process, a community area plan or just a refinement to the map itself. Next slide. So how you amend the map can happen in two ways, a policy change or a regulatory change. The regulatory change is essentially rezoning requests or through the rezoning process. And the policy change is through community area planning or a planning initiative related to or a partnership with the 2040 policy map. And we'll also produce an inconsistency report to help us track how we're deciding and making decisions with the map and if there needs to be an amendment process. Next slide. So there's two types of amendment levels, a minor and major. A minor amendment would be if it's consistent with the policy map adjacency, which is provided in the comprehensive plan. It gives us kind of a guidance on how place types relate to each other and how they work together to create complete communities. So there's policy guidance on what those adjacencies look like and if it implements the goals of the comprehensive plan. That's a pretty easy change we can make. A major change would be if something is inconsistent with adjacencies that are recommended for place types and it is inconsistent with the goals of the comprehensive plan. That just means we need to have more conversation with what's before us to make a decision. Next slide. So again, this is how that would work. The major and minor in terms of a policy change, that can be recommended by staff or the community. And then the major would be staff or a community partner, and then all of these go before council for approval. Regulatory changes are the same process for both. It can be a part of the rezoning process and council makes a decision to make a change to the policy map or not. in both instances, whether it's a minor or major. Next slide. So here's how planning continues in the future. Once the policy map and the Unified Development Ordinance are adopted this spring and summer, we begin, our planning team begins to produce the Comprehensive Plan Annual Report, which gives us a snapshot of where we are since the plan was adopted. We plan to launch our Community Planning Academy. Again, our community will continue to be engaged around this type of work on an ongoing basis, so we will use our academy to continue those conversations and create more leadership around planning in the community and our next level of citizen planners. We also want to create a community area planning toolkit for those neighborhoods who want an area plan and want to get started on their own. So we'll give them the tools to get started. And then we'll start the community area planning process in the fall, along with alignment rezoning that will align the place types and the zoning, adopted zoning ordinance districts. Next slide. Here's the planning approach. There's a couple of hierarchies. Comp plan is our guiding light. Community area plans are that third phase of that, where we go really down into the neighborhoods and have those parcel by parcels specific conversations around future growth and what types of investments need to happen to support the vision within those areas. Next slide. Here is how we plan to prioritize. These are just a few or some of the metrics that are within the adopted comp plan that says here is what we should think about when prioritizing which planning areas go first. There are 15 planning geographies, and we know we can't do them all at once. And these prioritization criteria will help us to decide which areas go first. Employment and population changes, looking at our equitable growth framework, how are we doing with meeting those metrics, looking at those corridors or areas where there's vulnerability to displacement, areas where we have major public infrastructure investments like our Silver Line, and then just looking at how the areas might be changing in comparison to existing place type versus our future place type, and making some really intentional decisions around those types of changes. So here's just a snapshot of the criteria we'll be considering. Next slide.
Alicia, could you hang on a second and just go back to that? For community area planning approach, is that key prioritization criteria? Is transportation, does that fall under one of those categories when you've got, the public saying, as we do in many of our rezonings, I'm not against density, but it can't handle this kind of density on this street network or on this particular street? Where does that fall into the community area planning approach, that consideration?
So if you look at the second to last bullet, development capacity, that looks at just infrastructure. Also, as we see these larger developments, can the new development, can the area accommodate it? And so that's built into the process for considering, I guess, the decision-making for an area plan. These are just some of the key priorities for making sure which areas go first, because we'll have to do them in batches. But transportation is definitely one of those metrics that we'll look at.
Got it.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Next slide. So this slide really just summarizes key elements of a community area plan. We've, if you haven't been around, like some of us, like 15, 20 years almost, this looks very familiar. We kick off the process, developing a list, refine the boundaries, and then look at how the area's goals and their vision for their particular areas aligns with the comprehensive plan. And then we'll go into those detailed place types review and focus area planning. That's looking at parcels and investments or lack thereof, and trying to really take that granular look at how to really make the comp plan vision come to life on a neighborhood by neighborhood basis. And not just the vision part, but looking at what types of infrastructure and amenities need to accommodate that vision to make it really a complete neighborhood. Next slide. So here's the schedule of path forward. We are giving you guys an update today. Also, Planning Commission in a few minutes. We have them as well. And then we will be asking the Planning Committee for a request for recommendation tomorrow. And then coming back to you all for a recommendation for adoption on the 28th. And I'll pause now for any questions you may have.
Okay, I've got one, and then I'll see where we are with everybody else. Alicia, just to go over again, when you, when the map has been approved by council, before you get an area plan done, which zoning category is by right at that point? So if it was, let's say it was an N1 neighborhood, or it was a single-family neighborhood that's been rezoned to N2, which allows things that might not have been allowed under the old map, the original map, what can be built by right?
So the policy map does not change existing zoning districts or zoning designations. So by adopting the map on the 28th does not change a zoning, the existing zoning that properties have. Alice can talk a little bit about that translation from the existing zoning districts to the future zoning districts.
So once the UDO is adopted and effective, then the zoning districts that are on the ground today will translate into the zoning districts that are outlined on Table 3.1. But it's really not until you get into a rezoning, whether that's by the individual property owner or through a future alignment rezoning, that that policy map designation would come into play as to what you can and can't do on that property. Their zoning district that they have today will remain and then will get translated with the UDO.
Okay. But when the area plan then gets done, that could actually change it, couldn't it?
Down the road, when there's more detailed community area planning, then that could potentially change the place type designation at that location. But it's still, until there's an ultimate rezoning that occurs, then that will not change what someone can do on their property.
Or until the UDO is passed?
So when the UDO is passed, it'll be a translation of the zoning districts today to the zoning districts in the UDO. And they're fairly comparable.
Okay. All right, thank you. Let's see, I don't see any other committee members with questions. Braxton, Mr. Winston, do you have anything?
I didn't, but just for clarification to that point that were just made, even if you do change the place type map, that doesn't necessarily, now or in the future, that doesn't necessarily mean that the zoning district has to change one and one, because there are similarities between place types, right? So if you change from a neighborhood one, I'm just saying, for example, a neighborhood 1 to neighborhood 2, that growth strategy will change, but that doesn't necessarily mean the types of zoning and land use has to change, correct?
That's correct. So the zoning will not change unless there's a rezoning initiated by the property owner or a rezoning that's initiated through the alignment rezoning process.
Just to clarify again, we can, place types define growth strategies in areas. And when you change place types, that does not necessarily mean, change growth strategies, that does not necessarily mean you are making land use changes. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. If we don't have any other questions on that, we're going to go ahead and move along.
Madam
Thank
Chair, I had a question.
Oh, I'm sorry. I think I can't see you any longer, Mr. Driggs. I apologize. Go ahead.
It's all right. Is it the intention that over time there will be an area plan for every location in Charlotte, or could these just be isolated?
Yes, Mr. Driggs, every location in Charlotte will have an area plan.
And then the other thing is, the existing zoning stays in place. What is the time frame that you expect? How long do you think it will take to do that, the batch transfer that we did like for the TOD? Like, when is that likely to occur?
We are talking through those details, and we'll certainly bring that to council down the road. We are talking about potentially proactively rezoning some of the centers, but really the bulk of the city will go through an alignment rezoning like we did with TOD in a complementary fashion with the community area planning process. So that alignment process will be hand in hand with going out in the community for the policy work that Alicia's team will be doing.
We are talking a year or more, right? I mean, this is not something that's going to happen in a few weeks.
Correct. This will take a couple of years to fully complete the community area planning process.
And it's worth noting, no existing facility or building or anything is going to have to change, right? Like, you can change the zoning designation. That will be effective only when the time comes when somebody wants to do something else at that location. Is that right?
That's correct.
Thank you.
Okay, if we don't have any other questions, we'll go ahead and move on. Thank you very much. Alicia, you're still up for the next, I'm sorry, I lost the agenda, but you are up for the next category as well for the UDO. So why don't you go ahead and just go right into that?
I think this will be, I'll kick this off really quickly. This is Allison.
Oh, thanks.
She's like, I'm done.
Alicia's, wait, no. Go ahead, Allison.
Thanks, committee members. So today's UDO update is really going to focus on the economic impact analysis. And so we're going to talk through certainly a lot of the process and the purpose of doing this particular analysis of the draft regulations, and starting to talk maybe some preliminary findings that our consultants have found, and then talk about the next steps and when we'll be back in front of this group for more detailed information. And so I'm really going to turn this over now to David Green and to Matt Prosser to talk through the presentation. So turn it over to you guys.
Yeah, thank you, Allison. This is, hi everyone, this is Matt Prosser with Economic and Planning Systems. It's good to be with you again today. I'm joined today with David Green, and I'll let him introduce himself and his firm.
Hi, I'm David Green with Perkins & Will. We're a global design and planning firm, and I lead our urban design group. And I'm in Charlotte and currently working with Matt and the city team to evaluate the UDO.
Thanks, David. So, so David's firm and David leading work related to design issues, and my firm looking at the economic impact issues. And we're really fortunate to have David and his expertise helping us on this process, and has really helped illuminate a number of both design and economic considerations. And so really the purpose of our collective effort is to identify potential refinements for the UDO, and then also reflect to you what are some potential impacts of different policy considerations you may have that have come up through the process. So next slide. And so our process has been working with the development community to first identify potential issues with the draft UDO and starting to categorize them in terms of their impact. And then going through a pretty robust testing and analysis phase where David and his group are doing design testing, both prototype and actual sites. And we are looking at economic impacts, so development feasibility and more larger economic considerations. And then ultimately that'll be refined into a list of recommendations and considerations for the draft UDO. Next slide. And so just want to, sort of start with a reminder and reflection that with the policy plan and the comprehensive plan, we've really laid out a number of goals and objectives for the community, and using the policy map to reflect the physical locations that those policies start to get implemented, and really designate the land uses that are desired in different places. And the UDO is ultimately the tool that provides the regulation for development to match that community vision, both laid out in the policy plan, but also within the policy map. And so we're working hand in hand in reflecting the goals within the policy plan, their physical locations and characteristics in the policy map, and making sure the UDO reinforces that. Next slide. And so ultimately, the UDO has several aims, several intentions to achieve that goal. Two that are really specifically germane to our analysis is first the aim to promote economic development that balances the need of current and future economy with high quality with a high quality of life standard. And I really sort of that balance between the needs of the community going forward and ensuring that high quality of life is really something sort of key to our analysis. And a major part of that in terms of the UDO is making sure that we have a built environment that is not only preserving and enhancing the character of existing places, but also allowing our community to evolve in ways to create more distinct places and protect character as well. Next slide. And so ultimately, as with the goal of trying to make a great place for people to live and work, we are looking at how we balance the need for investment throughout the city with the returns that are required from both the outcomes the community wants to see, but also the returns of the development community and other private property owners, and making sure that our aspirations can be achieved through the UDO. Next slide. And so a really essential part of our analysis has been the coordination with the development community. So we've held three different rounds of interactive workshops with the development community that have had topics range from real high level discussions to very specific conversations. And we have also had additional sort of one-on-one conversations with various members throughout the process as well. And we've organized these multiple workshops around sort of 5 focus areas, which align with the policy map. And I'll talk about that in the next slide. But I wanted to mention we have had over 50 different stakeholders in the development community that's been participating throughout the process. And so a very robust outreach to that community, both from multiple perspectives, from sort of the capital equity perspective to more specific project developers, to the design community, the folks that are designing and ultimately building these projects. Next slide. So I mentioned those 5 focus areas, and we really wanted to align our efforts around the different place types as best we can to look at impacts. So we have a group focused specifically on employment-related place types and zoning districts, so manufacturing, logistics, commercial, those types of areas. We have an activity centers group, which is primarily our mixed-use areas, denser development areas. We have a neighborhood-specific group, which is more looking at single-family and sort of middle-density housing considerations. And then a separate group, which was really driven by the development community to consider adaptive reuse and redevelopment. And that was the suggestion that they had in the process that we've incorporated. And throughout most of these groups, we have, considered and talked about the impacts on affordable and attainable housing. But we've also formed a specific group looking at affordable housing. And that group has a little bit different aim in that it's not only considering impacts on housing affordability, but also ways that we can support true affordable projects, whether they're mixed income or 100% income restricted. How do we support those projects to be built and provide more flexibility than you perhaps would give for market rate development? So some of our recommendations coming out of this process will address specifically how we support affordable projects. Next slide. So next we'll move into specific issue identification and how we went through that process and what we're finding. Next slide. So in terms of economic issues, we're really looking what those impacts on investment are, and then also, what that means in terms of cost for the development community, but also the investment needed into the community. And then gauging that against the potential returns and the flexibility needed for projects to be created. And from design-related issues, David has been digging into parking, open space, tree save, development density, and a number of other issues. But those top 4 are really the ones that have had the most conversation throughout the process. Next slide. So some initial feedback, and this is sort of a high level of the initial feedback, and then we're going to dive into some specific examples. But first, we found there are some inefficiencies, we would call it, in terms of the structure of the UDO. It's a very monumental effort to take, several disparate ordinances and bring them into one unified ordinance. And so there's been some major progress made there, but there are some organization issues that we've identified, or the development community has identified some requests for how we can perhaps organize the draft a little bit better. And those are things we're considering and taking into account. Next, we've looked at specific cost impacts from specific regulations, but we're also looking at what the impacts are on development yield. So really, when we think about the hierarchy or priority of issues, regulations that impact the amount of development a project can create are often, what we've heard, more impactful than perhaps having to provide some additional tree or sidewalk. And so the reflection we've had from the development community is, yes, there are likely some things we need to do in addition to what we're doing now, but we need to make sure that we're being able to develop as much, or if not more, development than we are currently. And that plays into these other issues we're looking into. So is there more opportunity for flexibility with bonuses, the open space solutions, tree save? That's a large issue that we'll get into a little bit more. And then also ways that we can incentivize affordable housing. We've already talked about that. Next slide. So in terms of our testing and analysis of these different issues that the development community provided to us, we're going to walk through how we looked at those. So the next slide. Like I said, we're really trying to balance the two sort of aspects of the changes. So one, looking at investment, what's the amount of investment needed into a new project to meet the requirements of the UDO, and how does that impact the return? And both from a return perspective for the development community, but also for the community at large. Is the outcome we're trying to achieve being achieved? Next slide. And making sure that we understand that balance needs to be done in a way that creates the highest quality community that we can without overburdening the need for investment from both the public and private sector to achieve those outcomes. Next slide. And so, as we mentioned, there's a lot of data-driven testing analysis going on, looking at specific project issues, both from a prototype site and an actual site perspective, and then measuring those cost, investment, and return impacts from an economic perspective. And so, next slide. I'll let David get into a number of the issues that we're finding from a design perspective, and then I'll reflect how that's sort of impacting the economic components.
So we've been looking at a number of broad and specific issues, and part of the goal in all of this is modeling these so that we can understand that we're aligning the intent of the UDO with the outcomes that we'll see, not just through the modeling, but through the ultimate development. And as Matt said, a couple of the big areas are around open space, tree save, and building heights, which translates by and large into density. But then we've really been digging into a number of very specific issues that have come up in the workshops. And I'll say that we've run hundreds of models of development programs across this. And these are all done in a way that we can get data out of the models, but also get the physical development so that people who are going through and reviewing these processes can understand what it means to the project in terms of its impact on the physical environment, but also in terms of the development opportunities and development potential. Next slide, please. And so you can see this in one of the specific issues that has to do with open space impact. And so we're analyzing open space as it pertains to small parcels, among many other things that we're looking at. And we're setting up the baseline impact from the UDO. So what is the baseline that we would get if we followed the UDO specifically? And then looking at sequence scenarios, testing flexibility. And this is important because with the green area requirements and open space requirements, there's flexibility in the way that the project gets put in place, depending on the way that you address each of these areas with overlaps and ways to pay fee in lieu, et cetera, so that the larger community can understand what the potential impacts are of the UDO as it gets implemented. We're also looking at the deltas between intent and outcome. So there's an intention with the ordinance. We want to see these kinds of projects be developed, and how close are we getting to that intention with numbers, not just general ideas about the proximity of intent and outcome, but actually being able to look at the reality in specific situations between this so that we can evaluate the situation and make revisions where it's necessary. And then we're also looking at the impact from multiple data points. And this is important because the UDO carries a series of regulations that are all working in balance. And we need to make sure that if we're revising one particular element, that it's not having a negative impact on several of the other elements that work in terms of the way that the project's being developed. Next slide. And we're digging into very specific issues. We've been working with the community design group to look at something as specific as sidewall requirements. And so this simply has to do with the context within which we develop in some of our smaller parcel neighborhoods, understanding where we have taller houses next to houses that are existing that may be shorter, and really going through a detailed analysis to understand what the impact is from the current ordinance. Again, testing scenarios for viability, both from the perspective of maintaining context and continuity in the neighborhood, but also in terms of developability, and then aligning the intent and outcome, and then again, understanding how this is affecting the development process from several data points. Next slide. And so this is a fairly complex process, but we felt it was important so that we could get a very, very accurate understanding of the situation that we would see in terms of overarching development for a number of the zoning categories and a number of project types. And so what we're doing is actually modeling a series of developments on prototype sites that incorporate regulations that are in the current ordinance and regulations that are in the draft UDO. This allows us to understand the deltas in a very specific way between the current and the draft ordinances. It allows us to align across zoning categories so we can understand where the zoning category from the current ordinance most closely aligns to the zoning category for the draft ordinance. We also understand the impact that the UDO is going to have on multiple different kinds of development, whether residential, mixed use, or primarily commercial. Again, understanding what the outcomes are so that we're able to evaluate the alignment between the intentions of the UDO and what the outcomes would be in the project execution. And then all of these are looked at from multiple data points. We're also able to model this in a way that incorporates comments that we get in real time from the different communities to see what those impacts would be if we're looking at different issues, but also if we're making modifications to more closely, in some cases, align the intentions and the outputs. Next slide. And then we've dug into a number of actual sites. And so in this case, what we're doing is we're taking projects that have either been approved or constructed that we by and large think represent the intents of the UDO, and then evaluating how we would plan and design and build those projects under the draft UDO to make sure that that we're getting the outcomes that we want. And so we're looking at this as an impact on multiple actual projects. We're looking at areas of impact from the draft ordinance. And so all of these are categorized. And so in these projects, we can understand the implication of tree save, the implication of green area, the implication of open space requirements, of setbacks, of building heights, et cetera, using all of those data points to comprehensively evaluate the impact that the new ordinance will have on development. And then we're also looking at both multiple project types and also geographic areas. So mixed-use projects adjacent to N1 or not adjacent to N1, higher density projects in South End, lower density projects that are in some of the more suburban areas, so that we get a good comprehensive view of development across the city. And I'm going to turn it back over to Matt now, and he's going to follow up with some of the economics.
Yeah, so to support David's design modeling, we've also built pro formas, financial pro formas for each of the actual site projects that we're looking at, and starting to identify some of the implications of those. And so This slide shows a analysis that we're doing related to the requirement for rear access for townhomes. And what we found, or David's analysis has found, for interior parcels or lots that aren't on two different streets, just have one street, providing rear access potentially impacts the amount of units that you can produce. And what we found, and this is somewhat true for a variety of issues, is that smaller projects are typically more impacted by some of these regulations. And so providing rear access actually reduces the number of units that you can get in a townhome development. And so if it's a 4 or 5 unit project, that has a substantial impact, where it might impact the feasibility of the project. Whereas if it's more of a medium size, say 13, 14 units, that impact is less profound and doesn't necessarily impact the return. And so in those instances, what we're doing is one, identifying the issue, two, measuring the impact, and then three, are having conversations with both the development community but also staff about whether this is a change that we want to make, if there's a change we want to make in the UDO, whether it's something we want to have further discussion or even consideration from you all around whether we need to keep the current draft or change it, or if it's something that we feel is a value of the community and perhaps not that impactful and doesn't necessarily need a change. Next slide. And so I mentioned we are looking at that both from sort of a feasibility perspective, but also considering what the impacts are on the value and affordability of housing. So this example looks at a previous project that took 2 lots and converted into 3 large homes. And under the draft UDO, you'll be able to actually do 6 units in that same 2 lots. And so what that does is it produces not only more total value for the project, but the likely selling price for those homes is substantially reduced. And so what we're trying to highlight is places where we're increasing value for the development project, but also how that translates into impact or potential impact on sales prices, rental rates, and those sort of things that impact specific users or buyers of property. Next slide. And one of the sort of bigger findings, and something that I reflected to you earlier, is just sort of looking at the investment return and sort of that realization that increased cost doesn't necessarily mean that there's a decrease in value for the project. And we really want to identify places where we're limiting the potential for development, that yield of development, and how that has really a greater impact in many ways than some of the sort of incremental cost increases that might come from specific regulations. And so we have metrics like the residual land value per unit for different projects that we're modeling to help illustrate how the current ordinance impacts the overall value of the project to the developer, considering both the potential for increased density or decreased density, but also the potential for increased cost or decreased cost based on the ordinance. Next slide. And so as we get into specific recommendations, we'll be bringing a lot more to you all. Next slide. But we wanted to highlight how we're tracking all of this. And so, David, were you going to talk through these two, I think?
Sure. I was just going to mention that we're doing a detailed tracking across all of the issues. Currently, we have over 80, and I fully believe we'll have well over 100. They're organized in section according to the draft UDO, so it's very easy to track where it is and what the request is or the issue is, and they're cross-referenced both to other sections in the draft UDO as well as the current ordinance. And then we're setting up a series of recommendations, and the recommendations are either to update the ordinance in some particular way, or to continue review in some cases where there's more detailed analysis required, or no action required because we believe through the analysis that the current, that the draft UDO is actually appropriate in the way that it's set up. Next slide, please. And these are just some examples of the level of detail that you'll see for all of these issues. Again, something that we touched on earlier about sidewall height. It looks like that's going to be something that needs to be updated, but it's going to require a bit more analysis in terms of what the actual text amendment is for that specific section. One of the issues was open space dimensions and sizes, and so this is something where there's a specific criteria set up, and through our analysis, we found that it can cause some constraints, and so we've opened that back up to more detailed modeling and analysis to understand if it needs to be changed, and if so, what the dimensional criteria are. And then something like the rear yard setback, when abutting an N1 district, currently it's required at 10 feet, and that's increasing to 20 feet. And through our analysis, we've determined that change is actually appropriate, so there's no action required. And so this is just an overview of the level of detail that we're getting into in this analysis process and the level of clarity in terms of recommendations that you all will be receiving across these issues, both broad and specific. Turn it back to Allison now, who I think is going to talk about next steps.
Thanks, David and Matt. Just wanted to end with just what happens next. So, of course, we're here today before the Transportation and Planning Committee to talk through just some initial findings and the process of what we're doing here in this analysis. And we've got some additional stakeholder work that we'll do this month. Next month, we'll come before the Economic Development Committee. We ran out of time earlier in the month, so we'll come back to that group in April. We will have another stakeholder meeting with the larger group that's been involved in this, and then work towards finalizing recommendations and finalizing the analysis both on the site and financial feasibility of the UDO. We'll come back before TAP in May with some recommendations, and this will allow us to incorporate these recommendations into the second draft of the UDO that will come out in May. And with that, we will turn it over to the committee for any questions.
Thank you all very much. Does anyone have any questions?
Madam Chair, could I just ask, you said you're going to do this for ED as well. Will they see the same slides, i.e. we?
I would imagine that they're mostly the same slides. If there's some updates, we may incorporate that into the ED committee meeting, but generally the same presentation.
And I can save my questions and not keep this committee any longer. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Driggs. Okay, thanks this is really detailed work. So, and I think Ms. Alexander has sent us the slides on this, so I appreciate that. It allows us to review it a little bit more, but I appreciate the information. And if there's no other questions, then we'll go ahead and wrap up. Okay, our next committee meeting is on April 11th. So with that, I would entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
So,
Thank you. Okay, thanks everybody. Appreciate it.